Okay, so today we're talking about the second episode of Amphibia. This is Best Fronds. And I don't have as much to say in this review as I had to say in the last one. Mostly because I'm not giving my first impressions of the show this time, but also because, as interesting as this episode was, it wasn't as interesting as the first episode. It felt like a message episode of a modern cartoon show. Which, I mean, I'm comparing it to things like Steven Universe or Gravity Falls or Star Versus. So, like, that's an endorsement. Don't get me wrong. It's just, aside from something at the very end, which I already expected to happen, and which I'm already working into that theory I talked about last time, this one didn't really do much in terms of making this world seem more interesting or to really further the lore. Though, that's not entirely true, and I will talk about that in a second after the very brief summation. Turns out Sprig is a pretty interesting kid who doesn't really fit in with the other kids, so he's never really had a friend before, and Anne decides that she wants to be his friend, mostly because he offers to take her to the lake. She was already planning to go to the beach with her friends from her world, and this seems like the next best thing. But Spriggs, does he call him Hop Pop? Is that what he's saying? Or is it Hop Hop? I can't really tell, but I do think he's definitely supposed to be Spriggs' grandfather. He doesn't want Anne to leave because the people outside are very judgmental of things they don't understand, and he doesn't want her to, like, set them off before they understand that she's not going to hurt them. Like, I'm paraphrasing what he said. Which I think is interesting because already at the start of the episode, he had already kind of reverted to thinking that she might want to eat them, despite the fact that she clearly doesn't find them appealing at all in that way. And he even dragged the kids back into that mindset along with him, however briefly, and I'll talk about this again in a second. So he locks the kids inside the house and then goes and falls asleep while reading a book with the key in his pocket. And Anne manages to peer pressure Sprig into helping her steal the key and then going with her to the lake anyway. They find a sign there, which Sprig deduces was written in a hurry and therefore must be super serious, which says not to swim in the lake, but Anne, again, peer pressures him into swimming in the lake with her, and they're attacked by a giant sea snake. It's Sprig's quick thinking, which leads to them escaping from it, and in the end they manage to get home before they're found out, but they do seem to have learned their lesson, and they're not going to be this reckless anymore. There's even little tidbits throughout the episode which tell us what kind of friends Anne's BFFs from back in her world really were, and maybe they were more sincere than this most of the time, but they definitely pressured each other into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Common teenager stuff. And so Anne, despite the fact that you can tell she doesn't really believe it deep down, has this impression that friends are supposed to coerce their friends to do things that they don't want to do if the first friend wants to do them. And when Sprig almost gets himself eaten alive to save the two of them from that water snake, that lake snake, I think I called it a sea snake earlier, it's not a sea snake, obviously, they're not in the ocean, you can tell that Anne comes to understand what a true friend really is. And no, they don't tell Sprig's grandfather that they snuck out. They don't confess to that. They do cover for each other, but I don't see a problem with that. Maybe it's not the best lesson to teach to kids, but the more subtle messages here, I think, are still obvious enough that kids will understand that, yeah, what they did was wrong. There's no need for them to be punished so they can learn the same lesson harder, I guess. Even though the story of this episode was pretty simple, there is still lore stuff here, subtle stuff in the background, things which speak to and imply the eventual themes of this show. Sprig's grandfather is more accepting of Anne than the others in the town are, and he clearly alludes to them being in some way racist towards her, which already is doubling down on a theme that seemed to be implied by the first episode. But then we also see something a little unexpected between the way that he is waiting to defend himself against Anne when she finally wakes up that first morning living with them, and the way that he frames his reasons for wanting her to stay in. It's clear that, more accepting than the others or not, he clearly has some biases as well, which feels like the show doubling down all over again on this theme that seemed implied by the first episode. So I definitely think that the show is going to develop this racism thing as a theme, as a continuing theme, which pops up in multiple episodes and is resolved over time. So already we have more clear evidence that the intention with this show is to craft a long-form story as a B-plot positioned behind a bunch of episodic A-plots. But then, this episode, not as much as the first one, but this episode still frames Sprig as the protagonist, with Anne being this secondary force, this being acting upon his life, mixing up the status quo, this mysterious figure whose true past still needs to be revealed. There was a brief flashback at the beginning of this episode, for example, which showed very clearly that Anne's backstory is going to be revealed to us in parts over time. That's not the kind of thing you see with a protagonist who doesn't have, like, an amnesia plot going on. So while she is clearly like a secondary protagonist, Sprig is still treated like the protagonist. He has to learn the lesson not to let peer pressure affect him, and while Anne also seems to learn a lesson regarding what real friendship is, it's far less overt. And then the mysteriousness of her character's nature is amped up at the end when some mysterious frog person is revealed to have found a shoe that she lost and takes it to one of Anne's other friends who has also been catapulted into this world, just in a different place, and uses it as proof that there are other humans here, that other humans came here with this person, implying that this person has been protecting Anne and the third friend, and flat out confirming that the other two girls who were in that opening sequence with Anne when she opened that box were brought to this world as well and are going to play a part in this story. Just not yet. They're going to play a part in this story down the line. This episode does seem to reinforce my suspicions that this show, at the very least, is trying super hard to, and I think so far succeeding at, being more than just a funny episodic kids show. And I do want to reiterate, because I didn't really bring it up much in the previous review, this is a funny show. It has excellent deadpan wit. I laughed out loud multiple times. You guys know how stingy I can be about humor. I was kind of half scared that by the time I got around to watching the second episode, I watched it immediately after I recorded the last review, just so you guys know, that it would dishearten me, that it would in some way prove me wrong, but so far it has done the exact opposite. It has only convinced me even more that I am right, that this show has a massive amount of potential. So once again, share this stuff around. Get people talking about this show, because it deserves it. As per usual though, guys, what did you think of Best Fronds, the second episode of Amphibia, if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.